I have the pleasure of presenting to some and introducing to others the keynote speaker for this afternoon, Dr. C. Nicole Mason, and I am not going to read her entire bio. But Dr. Mason is the author of Born Bright, A Young Woman's Girl Journey from Nothing to Something in America. She is also the director of the Center for Research and Policy in the Public Interest at the New York Women's Foundation. Dr. Mason also delivered at TED Talk and TED Women on the courage to disrupt and the gift of being difficult. So at this time, let's put our hands together for Dr. C. Nicole Mason.
Hello, hello, hi. So I'm really excited to be here, and I know that Abra did a round of thank yous, but I want to also extend my personal thank you to Abra and Mr. Hinton for having me here today, and the rest of the SDC team, Kim, Chantal, and everyone else that made this possible and just made me feel welcome here in Milwaukee. Last night, I had the wonderful opportunity to attend the Legacy Dinner and meet some of you that are here today. I got to hear about the work and legacy of Dan Stiles, an amazing leader who used his life to fight for the most vulnerable among us and provide anyone who is willing to work alongside him with the encouragement, support, and mentorship to help them carve out their own space and lane to do important work in their communities. The honorees last night were also amazing and humble. I'm sure it's an incredible feeling to be doing what you're called to do and be recognized and celebrated for it by your community. For many of us, it's really about the work. We don't expect a lot of recognition or reward, but when it comes, it feels so good, and you could see it in the faces of those who were honored last night. I do not take for granted this platform to speak to you today. It's truly an honor and a privilege. In this current political moment, when there's so much noise and where the truth of our daily realities can be hidden or invisible, I feel very fortunate to be able to share my story and to give you my thoughts on how we might deepen our commitment to those communities that we serve each and every day. There's an urgency to this moment that cannot be denied. The decisions that we make about how to engage with others and how we show up with the moral courage to support and protect and provide for those with less power, privilege, or ability will determine our future and whether or not we will become further disconnected or fully realize our shared humanity. I feel the weight of this responsibility, particularly as I work and I'm connected to many vulnerable communities. Now I'm feeling the need to be bold in my leadership and in my thinking about what is possible and what should be done. I'm not only thinking about the ways in which I can be an ally, but the ways in which I can take a stand and live my commitment to building a more just and equitable society. About 2 years ago, some of you may have heard this story, but about 2 years ago, I became the coach of my children's soccer team. At the time, I was the only woman coach in our division. And I know what some of you may be wondering, but I've never coached soccer in my life or played. Before each game, it's customary to greet the other coach to go over the rules. On more than one occasion, when I would walk out onto the field, the other coach would look over my head and ask, "Where's the coach for the other team? I can't seem to find him." "It's me," I would say calmly. Inside, though, I was seething and vowed when we walked to our respective sidelines to kick some kiddie soccer ass. And we did, and we were undefeated. And chaos soon ensued. Once a coach requested that we switch goalposts because he said the field was slanted, giving us an unfair advantage. I agreed. And another time, we were reported to the league for excessive scoring. Up to that point, it seemed to be an unspoken rule that only men coach, even if they too had never played soccer. I decided to become a coach because I wanted little girls and other moms to see me and to know that it was not only possible to play, but to lead a team. In this very small instance, I was being a disruptor. I was challenging the way things had always been done. I believe that when we think about our day-to-day experiences in our lives, we can all find ways that we have been disruptors or have opened the doors for others so they might step more fully into their potential and into their power. In my time with you this afternoon, I want us to take a step back and interrogate our positions as supporters, politicians, advocates, and those who are doing the work on the front lines, and ask ourselves, are we doing all that we can, and are we doing all that enough to support the people who come through our doors? Are we gatekeepers or are we way makers? Is what we are doing in alignment with low-income people and families who are living in poverty? I think most of us would answer yes. But I want us to go a bit deeper. What does your yes mean? Is it a strong yes? By strong yes, I mean, do we make up with the idea to move at least one person towards their goal of self-sufficiency? Or do we make one phone call to an agency or to an office to build a bridge or change a system? For many of us, it's yes, let's do this. And on other days, it's wow, this is really hard work. Am I doing this right? Because nothing seems to be changing or the needle is not moving fast enough. I also want us to talk about the assumptions and biases, hidden or out in the open, and real and perceived, that we carry with us while we're doing our work. To start, I want to share a passage from my most recent book, Born Bright, A Young Girl's Journey from Nothing to Something in America. By way of background, I began writing the book several years ago, and it was supposed to be a straight policy book. I was going to tell you about the problem, and then I was going to tell you about the policies that we need to fix it. But in my proposal, I included a small vignette about my family. And when I sent it to publishers, the editor wrote back, and she said, while I like the story, I like public policy, what really I think you should talk about is your family. My mother was a single mother, and she raised both me and my brother. She said, you should talk about that and how your life helps you understand your work and poverty and what should be done and what's missing from the national conversation. To convince me, she said, it'll be easy. This is your life. You can write about it. I mean, it's no big deal. But it really wasn't. Going back to revisit my childhood and filtering it through the lens of my current work and trying to reconcile the two was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. And I also felt a tremendous amount of weight because I knew that people like me didn't or rarely get a chance to tell their story in such a national and public way. So I felt a really big burden and commitment to my community to get it right. She said she knew it would be hard, but she believed that my story was worth telling and sharing. So I did. So here's a piece of it. This is from A Day of Reckoning. The chandelier with its dangling diamond-shaped cut glass seemed brighter than usual as I looked up at it from the stage. I surveyed the audience, consisting of the usual do-gooders, social workers, politicians, and policy advocates. I jotted down the word systems in all caps and underlined it twice. The oversized room was elegant, the tables dressed in white linens, and it had the good chairs, the ones with the cushiony carpet-like bottoms, the ones you're sitting on now. I was there to talk about poverty. I had delivered some version of the same speech nearly a dozen times in the past year. I barely had to prepare. Each time I gave a talk, polite applause circled the room, and I was flooded with invitations to speak at the next event. I knew just what to say to not ruffle any feathers. Stronger programs, more money, stricter rules, and the development of life skills for the impoverished. However, I was growing uneasy with the lie. What we were saying worked, did not. When my turn came to speak, rather than give my usual spiel, I wondered out loud if it was the systems that were broken and not the people. I spoke about the need to examine institutions and structures in our society and in communities that impede rather than support self-sufficiency and economic mobility for individuals and families. Standing behind the podium in my nicely tailored suit, I felt safe saying what I've been thinking for so long. I was the director of a research center at NYU. I felt comforted by the position and believed perhaps I would be heard. I was an authority. During the question and answer period, a woman stood and identified herself as a social worker employed at one of the many agencies scattered throughout the city that supported poor and low-income families. "This comment is for you, Dr. Mason," she said. While she agreed that the system did need some tinkering, she said that what was really missing from the equation was individual responsibility and that people needed to help themselves. A flash of heat washed over my body as I What? What happened? Okay. I feel like it's cold in here. No. Okay. So. Okay, all right, I'm gonna get back on track here. Okay, so a flash of heat washed over my body as I realized she was talking about me. In that moment, I was transported back to the countless hours I spent as a child waiting with my mother for social services in oversized rooms in unmarked city buildings. At the break of dawn, we rose to catch several buses, only to be told to come back another day because we were missing some document or that our application was still under review. For their part, social workers seemed contemptuous and treated us as if they were doing us a favor by giving us a ration-sized aid. Undeterred, we would return the very next day. "That's not true," is all I could muster before a skinny white man with wiry glasses began to speak. "I agree with the woman over there," he said, pointing in the direction of the woman who had just challenged me. "There are programs out there, and the women, I mean families, are not doing their part to better their situations. I see it every day." As I scanned the room, the sea of white faces with specks of color here and there seemed to agree with them. There was no dissent, only stillness. My stomach churned as I shuffled my papers. My eyes darted across the panel. Was anyone going to say something? Why hadn't I just stuck to my notes? When I did, everything went well and the narrative remained intact. By narrative, I mean the stories we all have in our heads about the lives of poor people, their behavior, and the reasons for their circumstances. In this forum, I was not only disrupting that narrative, but also challenging the financial investments, institutions, and structures predicated upon the understanding of the poor as lazy, infantile, morally corrupt, in need of direction and supervision. It was the narrative that consciously or subconsciously most of us in the room were responsible for perpetuating in some form or another through our work as advocates, practitioners, and legislators. I swallowed hard. I did the right thing. I'm the beneficiary of many of the programs that we're talking about here today. I attended Head Start. I was involved in after-school programs. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from high school, to attend college, and to earn a PhD. By now, my voice was shaking, but I could not stop. I was having in public the private conversations I reserved for my first-generation Black and Latino colleagues who had successfully navigated their way out of poverty into the middle class, and who had a deep understanding of the journey from there to here. These people in this room were strangers. But I'm only one person, I continued. Growing up, I knew many kids in my neighborhood who were smarter and more capable than me, and they didn't make it out. Many have been killed, gone to prison, are living hand-to-mouth, or otherwise on the margins of society. Should I blame them or the system that only allows a few of us out at a time? The room was pregnant with silence, and I couldn't take it back. I felt like an intruder and exposed. In these types of settings, my personal experience with hunger, poverty, episodic homelessness often go undetected. It's assumed that I'm just like everyone else, a policy expert, an academic. Typically, when a woman is invited to tell her story during these panels or these conferences or meetings, it feels really voyeuristic and slimy. Her story has a perfect, predictable arc. She was lost, then found by one of the many social service agencies in the city. She's changed her behavior, became a better mom, and although she struggles to make ends meet, is on her way to economic prosperity. Her story is meant to inspire, to whip up emotion, and to make the people in the audience feel good about their work and themselves. It's not meant to challenge or change how we make policies or shift how poor people in our communities, our cities, or in the larger society are perceived. There's also a clear separation between her and the experts on the stage. They, not she, are deciding what should be done. Here I was blurring that line. I was both the subject and the authority on the matter. I had firsthand knowledge of the messiness of poverty and the feelings the poor internalize from birth, like the belief that our very existence is a burden on society. The collapse of this boundary made me uncomfortable. I had worked hard to disguise my beginning in life, from the decision to change my name during my first week of college to the effort of erasing words and phrases like can't and fence to go from my vocabulary. I had succeeded in creating the perfect, impenetrable middle-class mask. Now it was off. I wanted to share this passage because I believe what it does is ask us and to question and interrogate our own position in our work, as well as our assumptions and biases about the people who walk through our doors, live in our communities, and serve every day. We have to ask ourselves, is this the right program? Is this the right intervention? Is it rooted in the lives and lived experiences of low-income individuals and families? Are we focused on individual families, or are we working on the structures and systems that often serve as impediments to full economic security for families? The other thing I want to add is that, are we seeing the whole person and the complexity of their lives, or am I fitting the person into a predetermined narrative of what's possible for people like them? These are the questions I believe that we need to begin to ask with fierce urgency. The answers, I believe, will change the way that we do the work. Next, I want to talk about the importance of being seen and belonging. Regardless of who you are or where you come from, everyone wants to know, do you see me and do I matter? The first person to see me was my second grade teacher, Miss Slaughter. She was the first person to tell me that I was smart and ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up. Although I didn't have the answer at the time about what I wanted to be when I grew up, her ability to see me changed the trajectory of my life. From then on, I not only believed I was smart, but that I was capable. When people and family walk through our doors, they are wondering, and to themselves, do you see me? From individuals who come from adverse backgrounds or have overcome tremendous obstacles, these questions hold considerable weight and meaning. So much so that when they finally arrive to our programs, they are often at their most vulnerable and wondering if this will be the last time before something breaks through and happens for them in a big way. I don't think there's a secret formula. If people feel seen, if they feel valued, if they feel supported, they keep showing up and working to help to transform their lives. And they begin to dream and they begin to think bigger. And if they don't, they will not. Because at the end of the day, we do all want to be seen. Next, I'd like to talk about people power and the power that we all have to change the course or trajectory of someone's life with small, deliberate acts of kindness and generosity. At the age of 17, I left to live with my paternal grandmother in Las Vegas, Nevada. I attended school during the day and worked 40 hours at night in a food court in a local casino. I knew I wanted to go to college, but had no idea how to get there. Up to that point, I couldn't have told you the difference between a state college, an Ivy League college, or a liberal arts college. I just had no idea, let alone how to write a phenomenal standout college essay. Back in my hometown, there was a woman there who was a special education teacher, Miss Bowen, who had a reputation for getting kids like me into college. Although I had moved away, I was convinced that she could help me. On her advice, I applied to and was accepted to Howard University. When I shared the good news with my family, a relative was quick to point out something I could not see at the time. I had no way to pay for it. I was crushed. The letter that moments earlier felt like a golden ticket became a heavy weight in my hand. For the next month or so, I used a payphone across the street from my high school to contact my teacher back home in California for help. On most days, I left a message, and on others, I waited patiently on hold until the bell rang for the next class. Frustrated that time was running out, I boarded a Greyhound bus to my old high school in California during the wee hours of the morning. Before the first bell rang, I was standing in the doorway of Miss Bowman's classroom begging for help. I told her I had been accepted, but had no idea how I was going to pay for it. She was stunned. I was supposed to be in a similar classroom 4 hours away. Seeing the urgency in my eyes, she asked me to step out of the classroom while she made a phone call. When I returned, she announced that I received a full merit scholarship to Howard University. I made it home that evening just in time for my shift at the food court. That summer, I boarded a plane with $200 in my pocket for Howard University, believing it would be enough for a lamp for my dorm room, textbooks, and food. It wasn't, of course. It was my first time on an airplane and outside of my community in any real way. I wanted to share this story with you for two reasons. The first is that I believe if it wasn't for Miss Bowman and her love for little black boys and girls like me that really had no clear pathway out, I wouldn't be here standing before you here today. She was doing her part in her own way to ensure that we did not fall through the cracks. I believe that we all have the power to be Miss Bowman in our communities and in our work. She picked up the phone and made the call. She didn't ask, "What are you doing here? Why aren't you in school?" It was that small act that yielded life-changing results. When I showed up to her doorstep, she didn't hesitate. She knew just what to do, and it saved my life. The other is that it's been nearly 2 decades since I boarded that plane, and as I talk to you today, not much has changed about the conditions of the communities, Compton, Inglewood, and San Bernardino, California, that I called home as a child. What is true is that the public schools in many of my neighborhoods and our neighborhoods are in far worse condition than before the passage of Brown versus the Board of Education, and more segregated than ever. And the achievement gap, despite efforts, continues to widen and remain unchanged. I believe the same is true for neighborhoods here in Milwaukee. Recently, there's been a lot of conversation about the role of grit and resilience on life outcomes. It's the idea that our success in life is much less shaped by how smart we are or even our geography, but by learning self-control, resiliency, optimism, and of course, grit. Grit and resilience, while helpful, will not end poverty or ensure that someone who starts at the bottom of the totem pole eventually ends up at the top. Less than 4% of people who start in poverty ever make it to the middle class. That means 96% of people are not. And this is not about how hard you work. We know that our ability to succeed in society is much less determined by our grit, our resilience, but by our zip code and the families we're born into. Like I said, growing up, I knew many kids who were much smarter than me that never made it to college. It wasn't because they didn't try hard or because they did bad things, but because they lacked the access to resources, information, or attended poor quality schools. I also lived next door to families that worked 40 hours a week or more that never seemed to make ends meet. A few of us, the lucky ones, will be brave enough to navigate broken systems over and over again until we reach the other side. But many of us will not, and we shouldn't have to. We need to build more connected communities. Connected communities are those that provide all the necessary preconditions for individuals and families to achieve full economic security from early childhood on. These are communities with strong schools, vibrant community institutions, including hospitals, access to necessary resources, information, or bridging opportunity, lower rates of violence, incarceration, arrest, and unemployment. They also have grocery stores, banks, and people and families are worried about where their next meal will come from. All of these things come together like a puzzle to create the necessary conditions under which people are able to pursue and reach their full potential without harm or stress. Across the nation, communities and neighborhoods of concentrated poverty are more likely to be disconnected, meaning that the conditions of the community are not set up to help people succeed. They are filled with landmines, obstacles, and hurdles seemingly meant to do the very opposite. It's not wholly about individual behavior, this is structural. If you are worried about securing the basics, housing, food, education, or staying safe, you don't have the time and space to dream. In a real sense, poverty itself, including the conditions created as a result of it, is the #1 barrier to escaping poverty. You understand what I'm saying? It's the number, For many, it's like swimming upstream. So I believe we must create stronger communities and provide the scaffolding to allow people to make mistakes and to know that mistakes are part of their journey and not the end. Next, I've spent a lot of time working in both urban and rural communities, researching and connecting. Currently, I'm working in the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia in rural communities. I'm doing my part to bring the stories and lived experiences of those families there to the national stage. I've learned 2 things in doing this work. The first is that the shortest bridge between 2 people is the story. I grew up in and around Los Angeles, we were poor working class people. And when I heard the stories of the families living in rural communities and their struggles, I could see myself. I could see my mother, I could see my aunt, I could see my family, and I could see my community. The other thing I learned is that in reality, working class people and those living in poverty are more similar than they are dissimilar. The working class, defined as people who are employed for wages, especially in manual or industrial work, constitute 43% of all U.S. workers. Collectively, these workers are more likely to earn the federal minimum wage, rely on public benefits such as food stamps or Medicaid compared to other groups of workers to make ends meet. Regardless of race, they are also more effective when a corporation moves its operations, an industry disappears, or when a recession depresses an economy. And we've seen that here in Milwaukee in the manufacturing industry. Whites now comprise 59% of the working class, but by 2032, the working class will be overwhelmingly majority minority. The reason for this is not because people of color are taking blue-collar jobs away from whites, but because blacks, Latinos, and women are historically overrepresented in the service industry and the retail sectors. Working class people have also been crushed under the weight of stagnant wages and the rising cost of living in both rural and urban settings. And one of the things, I'm taking a break from my notes, but one of the things I've noticed is that we've become really partisan, and we've been talking a lot about politics at the national level, but what's happening is that we're not talking about these bread and butter issues that families care about, and figuring out how we might work together across differences, whether it's rural and urban or black and white, to really make change and to really lift up families. I think that the anxiety caused by the inability to cover monthly bills and expenses while working 40 hours a week is not a rural or urban issue, a black and white issue, it's an us issue. And those who are struggling and working on behalf of low-income communities, we want to see the change and the shifts so that we can make sure that the people we work with have the opportunity to reach their full potential. Recently, I visited Seaverville, Tennessee, home to Dollywood in the Great Smoky Mountains. 36% of residents there live below the federal poverty line. While there, I met a woman who was employed as a full-time caregiver and worked part-time as a driver for one of the 2 major ride-sharing companies. Her husband was unemployed, and they were waiting to hear back from their mortgage company about a loan modification because they had been falling behind on their payments. I could hear both the frustration and resignation in her voice. She was losing her grip on the American dream. I could relate to her and her story because when I was a child, my family too had experienced a foreclosure, and so when we talked, we were able to connect, even though we were living two very different lives. In this current political moment, where partisan politics are so strong and divisive, I believe there's an opportunity to build an economy that works for everyone and to lift up the most economically vulnerable and marginalized in our society. The first step is doing so is recognizing where our realities and stories intersect, not where they diverge. In the time I have left with you, I want to return to where I began about the need for disruptors and waymakers. I'm a single mom by choice to 9-year-old twins named Charlie and Parker. My children are living dramatically different lives from the one I lived as a child and those of the nearly 21 million children who live in poverty in the U.S. Thankfully, they've never had to experience hunger, homelessness, or direct or indirect violence, and they generally have their emotional and physical needs met on a daily basis. They also attend a high-performing and well-resourced, thank you. Thank you, he was cleaning up clearing the table earlier. They also attended a high-performing and well-resourced public school in our community where I volunteer my time regularly. In a casual conversation with one of their teachers at their school, I learned about a homeless student who was having trouble focusing and learning in class. He, along with his siblings and mother, lived in one of the local shelters in our city. In kindergarten, he was already so far behind and needed extra support, much more than the teacher could give. The sharp contrast between the lives of my children and that of their classmates was palpable to me. He deserved the same chances, supports, and opportunities as my children, I believed. He was already slipping through the cracks of multiple systems. The question for me, and I have for all of us, is how do we work to make sure that all children have what they need to be successful and to thrive from early childhood on? I think we're being really dishonest when we say that the homeless child is as well positioned for success and opportunity as the middle and upper middle class child. I believe that if we look beyond our immediate comfort zones and the comfort that comes from knowing that we are safe, economically secure, or in good health, and look to join and to build where there are deficits, disparities, or children going without, and if your community is anything like mine, you really don't have to look far. And I think while it's important to keep an eye on what's happening nationally, the real work and change is happening in our communities and is in our daily efforts to connect, support, and stand in solidarity with our neighbors and those who are the most vulnerable in our society. I think this kind of disruption, where we're actively seeking to change systems and institutions and to meet the needs of the most vulnerable among us, is the most important because it requires that we do the work to understand the lives and experiences of others. I just want to say that when I was a little girl, if someone told me that I would be here speaking to you today, I would not have believed him. As a brown-skinned girl born to a teenage mother in Los Angeles, California, the expectations for my life were carved out before I could ever begin to imagine what I wanted for myself. I suppose this is true for all children, including those born into privilege. Our environment, our homes, schools, and communities, along with our primary caregivers, signal to us what we can expect or how far we can go in life. I was expected to be what I saw and not aim higher. However, it was the people along the way, like many of you in the audience, that helped me to become who I am today. A mother, a researcher, a doctor, and most importantly, someone who believes that we're all connected and that we all have the responsibility, even when we're doing well or have succeeded, to reach back and to help others who are not where we are. We're all into this together. Thank you so much. Do we have time for questions? We do. Okay.
We have one here.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm State Representative David Bowen. I represent 55,000 people in the city of Milwaukee and the village of Shorewood. As you talked about people comparing, especially the outcomes that middle class and stable young people with stable backgrounds and lives are able to attain in education and so many other things, but comparing them to homelessness, what is that rooted in? For me, I would think it's rooted in maybe insanity or people that are not connected to the reality of what young people are really dealing with. But why do you think so many people end up creating those comparisons and still expecting the same result?
Well, I think that's, first of all, it's a really good question. I think people make those comparisons because it's easy to make those comparisons and focus on the exception and people who have done it and say, well, look at them, they did it. You know, it's not the system, it's you. That's a little bit more comfortable as opposed to taking a look at, again, the 96% who are not, who have not made it out. So a lot of times when I do talks, they say, well, you know, I don't even know, I've been called a fraud for writing the book. They said, you can't even talk about this because you've made it out. I said, no, that's why I should be talking about it. And instead of, the question shouldn't be, how come you made it out? The question should be, why didn't other people make it out? And that's...
Next question.
I always got a question. Hi. Over here. Over here. So, my name is Crystal West. Have you noticed that throughout your time of gathering your information, if you come across academics before you got to where you were, that would say, you're not an academic, you don't know what you're talking about. And then you have other organizations or agencies that don't believe in community-based participatory research, or when they're going that and they say, oh, we've got the answer to everything, and then not asking the question of what's needed. So for me, like when you were in that room of individuals who were looking at you like you didn't know, me, I'm a tiger. I would have just like, look, this is the reality. And we find that a lot in our work with community health. You'll come across and you'll say to people, you need to be doing this. This is what's needed. And they'll say, do you have the credentials? I have tangible evidence. Tangible evidence. And sometimes it's met with the eyebrows like, no, I'm gonna wait for the data. And while they're sitting around on their asses waiting for the data, real lives are being impacted. And so when you're getting out there and you're on the ground floor and you're trying to do everything that you can do, and people still look at you like, yeah, I'm gonna wait for the data. In my heart, and sometimes in my voice, I'm screaming, get off your ass. This is what needs to be done.
Now, did you want me to respond to that? It sounded like at first it started off as a question, and then it became a whole, power to the people.
I got issues, I'm sorry. It is a question. It's just when you're dealing with agencies or individuals who are in an academic or financial position, and you are telling them, I've lived this, I've done this, I've been poor, I did this. My husband and I bought our house in 3 years, paid for. And so people look at us like, how'd you do that? So we're telling them, and then they're like, well, you don't have the credentials. When you're in that room and you have those individuals, I've had people tell me to be humble, be quiet. What would you do?
For me, I just, there's a couple of things. I believe in the power of community participatory research. I think communities have the answers, know the answers. I think academics are often detached, and policymakers as well. They don't know what's happening in communities, and so there's a big disconnect between what's happening on the ground and what's the policies that are being made. So for me, I think that it's really important that communities, where they can, produce their own data, tell their own stories, their own reports, and again, not wait for the validation from an academic institution or policymakers, because sometimes it never comes.
Thank you for answering that. And my question is about belonging and maybe internalized narratives. Can you speak to how you've reconciled that where you're at now, and give a little bit more about how you've done that along the way? Like, who are your people? Who do you get to decompress with, and how do you build yourself up again to continue to do this work?
That's a really good question. So when I first left to Washington, D.C., and I came home for the summer, I had a lot of survivor guilt, and I felt very guilty for leaving my community. So at home, they call me Pumpkin. So if you would have called home and tried to talk to me, they would say, you said Nicole, she would say she doesn't live here. And so when I went home for the summer, all I wanted to do is go back and be Pumpkin. And, I don't know anything. I didn't learn anything. I just wanted to go back to being who I was. But I realized that I had changed. I was a new person. I had, been exposed, and I wanted to bring everybody with me, but realized that I could not. And so I had to really think, well, then what is going to be my role? What will be my role? And it was this work, so I knew that I could bring the stories and the experiences and everything I knew firsthand to these circles and rooms of power and influence, and say, hey, that's not right. What you're saying about poor people, and you're talking about my community, first of all. I think that's been really powerful, but it's also been really hard because in some of these circles, they're really not really open to shifting and changing. And so, and they're used to listening to the same voices and regurgitating the same data, the same narratives. And when I push back, it becomes a litany of, oh, well, this person they went to Stanford, they did this. I don't care if they went to God University. This is not right. What you're saying about my community and getting funding to say about my community is not okay. So that's, that could be hard and isolating, because, that is my academic and intellectual community. So what has sustained me in this work has been opportunities like this to share my story and to be around like-minded people who are doing the work and believe that change is possible and happening. And then, I have a really great group of sister friends and community that I lean on and talk to and be like, did you see that fool? Blah, blah, blah. They're like, okay. And so that's been really good for me.
Next question.
Thank you, and I want to really express my appreciation for you sharing your story. There are a number of common threads that your story has with mine. One, my granddaughter, my first granddaughter, calls me Pumpkin. I never thought I would be called that by my grandchildren, although I have one. I did have a designated name, but she refuses to call me that, so. And she vacillates between my designated name, grandmother name, and Pumpkin, so I guess I can kind of settle on Pumpkin now. But I wanted you to share a little bit more. I'm from Mississippi, about your work that you said you were doing in the southern states with us, if you don't mind.
So that has been some of the work that I've done in the South has been some of the most transformative work that I've done. So I've been working with the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative, and it's a coalition of organizations in the rural South, and with more than 150 human rights commissioners who are women in the South. And so what's been amazing, and I've been working with that organization since I was about 22. And after I got my doctoral degree, I went back and said, okay, before I was doing these little workshops, but I want to learn and study and then take what I know and what I learn out nationally. And so about 2 years ago, I completed a report for them on economic security and low-income women in the rural South. And it was the first report of its kind that mapped what was going on, the disappearance of industries, the condition of families, on all these indicators. And it received so much attention. And it really told the story of women and families in the rural South. And what it did for me, that was the first time I was able to connect my experiences growing up in LA with the experiences of Black women and families in the rural South. And now I'm working on a report for the Southwest Georgia Project where we're looking at building a local sustainable food economy run by the people. And that's really exciting work because I know from the research we'll be able to attract funding and all these other things. And again, I can't say enough about how the community is driving the research and the work and not the other way around. With policymakers and other people.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Linda, and first of all, thanks for visiting Milwaukee. We appreciate it. Also, thank you to George and the SDC just for this opportunity to learn together. It's been really amazing. I just have a quick question. In the work that you're doing, do you have examples of communities that are actually moving the needle on poverty that we could study and learn from?
That's a really good question. In terms of moving the needle, so I think there's some interesting work coming out of Colorado and looking at two-generation strategies and connecting women and families, so a two-generation approach that looks at early care and education as well as employment and economic opportunities for women. And they're doing some really interesting things there. I have to be honest that there's a lot of work happening across the U.S., but much of it, we haven't been able to really move the needle on poverty in the way that I think we all would have wanted to in our work. And so we've been having incremental and small movements and changes like individual success stories, but I don't believe until we start really looking at the structures and institutions that are responsible for some of the conditions that we will ever really transform and change and end poverty in the way that we say that we want to. And I don't see many states really places.
Thank you, Dr. Mason. We're going to take this question and one last over on that side of the room. Then Dr. Mason is going to move out into the foyer here, and she'll have book sales and book signings. And if you want to take a brief moment for a photo opportunity, that's available as well.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mason. My name is Lisa Jones. I do racism work mainly with white people. The question I have, white people need to solve racism. The question I have is, Dr. Robin DiAngelo had an article that hit the other day saying white people are still raised to be racially illiterate, and I also include culturally in a lot of cases, and don't recognize the system and the action and it upholds the current system. The question I have for you is that there are many people and good people who are doing this work and good white people who want to do this work well. Can you speak to the racial literacy and the cultural literacy that people, when they're serving people that don't look like them, that don't come from the same cultures, what do they consistently need to do to make sure that they are staying relevant to the people they are serving and not going into a white savior complex, but really working with and walking alongside them?
That is like the million-dollar question around these parts. So I think that's a really important question, and for me, because I've been working in the nonprofit sector, around these issues, for a long time. And I think that there's space for accountability, awareness, and just doing the work. I think that many of us get comfortable and in the way that we do our work, our thinking, our social location, and our perspective. And by doing that, we are not pushing ourselves and stretching ourselves to really figure out, am I doing more harm than good? Is this what is really supposed to be happening, or am I getting in the way? Or some of my implicit bias or even explicit biases preventing me from doing the necessary work so that I can be here and be present and help families in the way they should be helped. I do not think that it is a responsibility or the main responsibility of people of color to call out racism or these structures that are where racism is embedded. I think it's the work of our allies and white allies to be doing that work and speaking out. And I have to say, it doesn't happen as often as I believe that it should happen. Many times we are the ones, or people of color are the ones to bring up these issues in a real significant way. So, I think we have, as organizations and a movement that works together, I think that we still have tremendous amount of work to do. I mean, I think that our current political moment, where we are, sort of signals that we have not come nearly as far as we have thought we have come. And so I think this is we have a real opportunity to go, all of us, a bit deeper in terms of our work.
Last question.
It's just fell right into place because everything I was going to say related to some of the things you said. But recognizing that systematic inequality is needed by the powers to be in order to maintain control in our society is something that we need to make sure that those who are calling them so-called nonprofit organizations to so-called help people who are in need be made to recognize that until you deal with who's benefiting from maintaining poverty in our communities so that they can see it firsthand, as you have been showing already, we've got to make sure all these profit making, because they make them off of us. People are the ones that we as blacks basically are utilized as a group that they use to say there's need in poverty, when the percentage of people in poverty basically right now in quantity are white folk, but the percentage is black folk because of the smaller quantity of black folk. These are the type of things that I think we as black people need to get these nonprofits to understand and to recognize that. And so until we change that system and get them to change it, because they're the ones that are implementing that system and maintaining it, sometimes knowingly and sometimes unknowingly. So as far as you could think about, I know that the white folk have to do it, but we have to work to make sure that we get involved in voting and putting people in to make sure we can make the changes in our society.
I agree. All right, this has been amazing. So thank you so much, and thank you for spending your lunchtime afternoon, and I just look forward to meeting you all outside of here and at the conference. Thank you.